The man known to history as the Roman Emperor Hadrian, or Publius Aelius Hadrianus, was born on the 10th of January 76 AD in the southern Spanish city of Italica. His mother, Domitia Paulina, was of Spanish descent, her family hailing from the city of Cadiz, modern-day Cadiz, which was one of the wealthiest cities in Roman Spain, and a year before Hadrian's birth, Domitia had also parented a daughter named Aelia Domitia Paulina. Hadrian's father, Publius Aelius Hadrianus Afer, was a wealthy Roman senator who had served with distinction with the Roman army in North Africa, and whose mother, Ulpia, was the sister of Marcus Ulpius Traianus, the father of the future Roman Emperor Trajan. That made the young Hadrian Trajan's second cousin once removed, which was a family connection that would prove to be crucial for all concerned, including Rome itself, over the coming years. The Roman Empire of the late 1st century was vast, having been gradually expanded over the previous 3 centuries in various wars against rival kingdoms and tribes throughout Europe and beyond. This meant that, by the time of Hadrian's birth, few, if any, rivals could match its wealth, technological advancement, and most importantly, its military, which was arguably the most advanced, organized, and capable fighting machine the world had seen up until that time. After the death of Julius Caesar by assassination in 44 BC, his nephew Augustus had claimed power in a bloody civil war, in which he defeated the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and made himself the first Roman emperor. Since then, despite the Senate's continued existence, control over the empire lay in the hands of the emperors in collaboration with the Roman army, which would itself become the real arbiter of power in the empire over the following centuries, as no emperor could hope to last for long without the powerful backing of the legions. At the time of Hadrian's birth, the emperor of Rome was Vespasian, who had himself seized power with the backing of the eastern legions of the Roman army in 69 AD. However, after his death in 79 AD, supreme power in Rome had been handed down to Vespasian's children, Titus, and then later Domitian, who would himself rule the empire for 15 years. Hadrian, who was 9 or 10 in 86 AD, was still living in Spain at this time. However, his world and destiny would soon change forever when both his mother and father suddenly died, meaning that he and his older sister were then placed under the protection of Publius Aelius and their second cousin Trajan, who, by this time, was an important army officer with his own legionary command. After his parents' death, Hadrian initially stayed in Spain for 4 years, but was later summoned by his cousin to Rome in around 91 AD, at around the same time that Trajan was given the powerful position of consul. However, despite the fact that Trajan, like Hadrian, had been born in the Spanish city of Italica and saw himself as an upstanding Roman, he nonetheless faced resentment and ridicule from the old Roman nobility, who did not take well to anyone from the provinces who aspired to office within the imperial capital. Over the coming years, Hadrian would continue his education whilst in Rome, expanding his knowledge to a great extent, even earning himself the nickname Greekling due to his love of all things Greek. Indeed, Grecian culture would become one of the greatest influences and loves of Hadrian's life. However, this nickname would not be seen by Trajan as anything but an insult, as he was interested only in military matters and matters pertaining to Roman politics. Despite his cousin's concerns, Hadrian was an avid pupil and, according to accounts, became a student of the arts as well as architecture, and also proved himself to be ambitious and a good public speaker. But after concluding his academic education, Hadrian later returned to Spain, where he was further educated in more practical pursuits, such as outdoor sports and hunting, which were in essence a kind of basic training for military service, and in particular, boar hunting, which became one of Hadrian's favourite pastimes. Historical accounts also claim that Hadrian had something of a paradoxical personality, stating that he was austere and genial, dignified and playful, dilatory and quick to act, stingy and generous, deceitful and straightforward, cruel and merciful, and always in all things changeable, whilst other records credit Hadrian as having good leadership qualities as well as bad, whilst exhibiting the behaviour of a courtier and the craft of a marketer, but above all, he was a visionary genius, despite being vain, intolerant, and murderous. When he was aged 18, Hadrian returned to Rome to take a role in the imperial administration as a judge before joining the army as a tribune or officer and serving with various legions near the river Danube in Eastern Europe, and after proving his ability, he was promoted and posted to the 5th Legion in the modern Balkans, where, according to accounts of the time, he served with distinction. Then, in 96 AD, the Emperor Domitian was assassinated by court officials, prompting the Roman Senate to appoint Marcus Caecus Nerva as Rome's new emperor, which was a strange choice, as Nerva was old and childless, meaning that he was bound to be emperor for only a short time, which would soon prove to be the case. As well as being elderly, Nerva was also unpopular with the Roman army. Because of this, he appointed Hadrian's cousin Trajan as co-emperor, and also made him his adopted son, and therefore his successor, just to obtain the backing of the Roman army. Indeed, it is even suggested that Nerva was forced by Trajan to name him as his successor, as if he didn't, Trajan would depose him by force. But whatever the truth, this agreement was met with favor within the ranks of the military, as Trajan was popular with the ordinary Roman soldiers, and given Nerva's age, Trajan was likely to become emperor sooner rather than later. In a matter of months, Trajan, as well as Hadrian, had been catapulted into the limelight of power within Rome, and as Trajan had no children, Hadrian was now one of the frontrunners to become the next emperor. But this was soon made more likely when only 1 year and 4 months after attaining power, Nerva died, meaning that Trajan was proclaimed emperor of Rome in 98 AD. This accession to power also marked a considerable turning point in Roman history, as Trajan was the first Roman emperor, other than Claudius, to have been born outside Italy itself, and therefore the hostility the Roman aristocracy had previously shown Trajan was soon to reap its consequences, as the new emperor proceeded to promote more outsiders, including Hadrian, to powerful positions within his administration, as well as within the Senate. Despite being related to Trajan, Hadrian's rise to power was also aided by his close ties with Trajan's wife, Pompeia Plotina, who was a wealthy woman in her own right, her fortune coming from a successful construction business, and she, like Hadrian himself, had also been born in Spain. It is no exaggeration to state that Plotina, along with her husband and Attianus, were the key figures in Hadrian's rise to power and influence within Rome, as they had raised and protected young Hadrian, as well as his sister after their father's death, and Attianus would even become Hadrian's bodyguard in the years to follow, and many historians credit Plotina as having been responsible for Hadrian's education in Greek culture, which she herself held to be superior to Rome's own. As her marriage to Trajan was childless, Plotina perhaps looked upon young Hadrian as her own son, and in fact was said to have adored Hadrian, so much so that she would later in around 100 AD arrange the marriage of Hadrian to her grandniece, Vibia Sabina, when he was 24 and Vibia Sabina was 14. However, Hadrian was less than pleased about the arrangement, being more disposed to the intimate company of men, and his marriage to Vibia Sabina would prove to be notoriously distant and cold. In 101 AD, Hadrian was elected as quaestor within the Roman Senate, which meant that he would act as a go-between of kinds between the emperor and the Senate, particularly as there were, by this time, a large number of senators who, like Hadrian, hailed from the provinces, but there still remained a hard core of the old Roman aristocracy within the chamber who resisted and resented the foreigners' growing influence. On one occasion, Hadrian is said to have had read a speech of the emperor's to the Senate, which sparked a chorus of laughter within the chamber due to his accent and pronunciation, and taking this to heart, he endeavored afterwards to improve his Latin until he spoke the language as well as possible. That evidently paid dividends for him, as he would later go on to secure several high positions and even later become governor of Syria in 117 AD. As real power within the empire was based on the backing of the military, it was important for Trajan to spend a large amount of time securing their approval. Therefore, he sought to bring this about by embarking on his now legendary invasion of Dacia in 101 AD, which was the area of Eastern Europe around modern-day Romania. The only problem was that taking on the Dacians was a risky venture, as the Roman Empire had fought them before during the reign of Emperor Domitian, when they suffered a humiliating defeat, in which an entire legion was massacred. Despite this previous loss, Trajan was unperturbed. After assembling his armies and appointing Hadrian to his staff, he crossed the natural border of the Roman Empire, the river Danube, into Eastern Europe, at the head of 2 legionary columns, backed up by as many as 9 legions, which numbered in the region of 70 to 80,000 troops or more, marking the beginning of the First Dacian War. Hadrian was in Trajan's personal entourage at the start of the campaign that saw the Roman armies advance into the heart of Dacia, burning villages and settlements along the way until they met and defeated the armies of the Dacian king Decebalus at the Second Battle of Tapae in September 101 AD. However, before the battle, Hadrian was excused from military service and returned to Rome to take the post of tribune of the plebs, which was an administrative position which in essence represented the interests of the public within Roman government. Despite securing a victory over the Dacians, Trajan grew concerned about the onset of winter and decided to wait until the following spring to resume hostilities. This lull in the fighting was soon exploited by Decebalus to regroup his forces and launch a counterattack in the winter of 101 to 102 AD. This resulted in another defeat for the Dacians at the Battle of Adamclesi. This ultimately forced the Dacian king to sue for peace, which was agreed in 102 AD with favourable terms for the Romans over their defeated enemies. Due to this, a large part of Dacia, along with the Danube, was ceded to Rome, whilst Dacia itself became a vassal-like state, which would receive money and troops from Rome in return for acting as a buffer zone between it and the various migrating tribes to the east. But despite surviving the war, Decebalus had no intention of being Rome's vassal, and after an interval of several years in which he used Roman money to rebuild his forces and fortifications, he launched a surprise attack in 105 AD into the regions of Dacia he had lost to Rome 3 years before. This took Trajan by surprise at first, but he soon gathered his forces and constructed a massive bridge over the Danube, now named Trajan's Bridge, which according to accounts spanned over 3,700 feet in length. This formed the gateway which Trajan's legions used to march headlong into the Dacian heartlands once again, marking the start of the Second Dacian War in 105 AD. During this conflict, Hadrian was again in Trajan's personal service, at least during the early stages of the campaign, but later he went off to command his own legion, which helped to mark him out as a military leader and endeared him to the men under his command, that would later prove to be crucial in helping to secure his popularity with the Roman army over the coming years. After marching into the heart of Dacia, Trajan's legions then assaulted the Dacian capital of Sarmes Gatutsa in modern-day Transylvania, and after besieging the city and cutting off its supply of water, the capital eventually fell and was then razed to the ground on Trajan's orders to prevent it being used as a rallying point in the future, whilst Decebalus committed suicide by slitting his own throat. Word then reached Trajan that Decebalus had hidden the contents of his massive treasury somewhere nearby, and soon afterwards, its location was revealed to the Romans by a member of the Dacian king's entourage, leading to the hoard's recovery. This reportedly consisted of over 150 metric tons of gold and over 300 metric tons of silver, which was then used, after the Dacian War, to help fund various building projects and celebrations, one of which, Trajan's Column, still stands in Rome today and depicts the chain of events surrounding the Dacian Wars. With the fall of Sarmes Gatutsa, Rome was finally victorious, as Dacia was now firmly under its control. However, Trajan's campaigns would prove to be some of the last great expansions of the empire, as after his reign, merely maintaining the massive expanse of Roman territory would prove to be difficult enough, without the added costs in money and manpower of further expansion. Hadrian himself had emerged from the Dacian Wars as a seasoned military commander, and had now also gained first-hand experience in the everyday lives soldiers had to endure. This experience would prove crucial in the years to come, as Hadrian was now respected by the legion's rank and file, who saw him as one of their own. Following the Dacian Wars, Hadrian was appointed in 107 AD to be the governor of Lower Pannonia on the western border of Dacia, partly as a reward, and partly due to his knowledge of the region and its people, as at this time, there were still a number of hostile barbarian tribes to the north and west, including the Sarmatians, who had been allied with the Dacians against Rome during Trajan's campaigns. Hadrian was now, despite only being in his early 30s, a high-ranking general, as well as a talented administrator and politician, and was clearly marked out for greater things. That was borne out when in 108 AD, he was elected, despite his young age, to become one of Rome's 2 consuls, which was the highest administrative position within the Roman state and represented the pinnacle of Hadrian's political career before becoming emperor himself. After his tenure as consul ended, Hadrian then travelled to Athens in around 112 AD, where he was made the city's chief magistrate for a short time. That reaffirmed his love and connection with the city and Greece itself, but not much is known about Hadrian's life over the next few years, which seems to have been a period of relative obscurity for him, until once again, he was summoned to accompany the emperor on his next large-scale military expedition against Rome's great rival in the east, Parthia, in modern-day Iran. The Parthians were one of the few people who could match Rome's power. They had, like the Dacians, been responsible for defeating and humiliating Roman armies in past confrontations, and proved themselves to be perhaps the most stubborn and persistent of Rome's enemies during the middle period of the empire. Indeed, during its various wars against Parthia, Rome would continually struggle to hold any of its periodic gains in the Middle Eastern region. Another reason for the coming war was that Parthia had placed its own puppet king onto the throne of Armenia, whom Rome found unacceptable, as both Rome and Parthia enjoyed a kind of shared overlordship of the Kingdom of Armenia at the time that had been established during the reign of Nero. Therefore, Parthia placing a king onto the Armenian throne without Rome's approval was seen as grounds for an invasion. As well as this, Trajan possibly had other motives for expansion into the east, as it is suggested that he wanted to also gain total control over the eastern trade routes to and from the Roman Empire that passed through the Persian Gulf ports in modern-day southern Iraq, through which trade shipments from India and beyond passed. The expedition had long been in the planning, and like Trajan's Dacian campaign, involved up to a dozen legions, and once again, Hadrian was appointed to Trajan's entourage, which accompanied the emperor to successfully secure Armenia in late 114 AD, after which the Roman forces marched south into Mesopotamia, where they took the city of Charax near the northern shores of the Persian Gulf in 116 AD, which marked the furthest extent of Rome's eastern expansion. During this campaign, Trajan had successfully reduced the Parthians to the status of a near-vassal state, but the campaign had taken a considerable toll on his health, and he was, by this time, in his early 60s, which, combined with the hundreds of miles of travel, hot weather and stress, soon culminated in him suffering a stroke, meaning that his campaign days were over and plans were then set into place for the emperor to return to Rome to recuperate. Before leaving the region, Trajan made Hadrian the governor of Syria, which effectively placed him in charge of the Eastern Roman legions. But shortly after the emperor left the Middle East to return to Rome in the summer of 117 AD, Trajan's health began to decline even further, and he then died on the 8th of August 117 AD in Selinus in modern-day southern Turkey. As he had no children, Trajan's succession had been in a state of confusion for some years. However, a day after the emperor's death, his wife Pompeia Plotina presented a document which stated that the emperor, on his deathbed, had adopted Hadrian as his son and successor. This development was very controversial to say the least, as the emperor had not signed the document himself, leading to rumors that Hadrian was Pompeia Plotina's choice as successor and not Trajan's. However, it is highly likely that Hadrian was Trajan's intended successor, as he was the emperor's highest ranking and most experienced direct relative, and the late emperor had placed Hadrian in charge of the powerful Eastern legions shortly before his death. It was fortunate that Trajan had promoted Hadrian when he did, as having the command over the Eastern legions made securing the Senate's approval much easier, as well as making any rival claim elsewhere in the empire more difficult, as no one else could match the sheer numbers of troops Hadrian now had under his command in the east, troops whose loyalty was secured with the customary bonus or bribe. Once Hadrian was proclaimed Caesar by the Eastern armies, a letter was then sent to the Senate, who had little choice but to accept his accession, and celebrations were then held in the imperial capital and throughout Rome's provinces to mark his accession. And whilst Trajan before him had been, in large part due to his expansionist policies, one of the most successful and popular of all of Rome's emperors, in contrast, one of Hadrian's first acts as emperor was to withdraw his troops from Parthia and make peace there, and also to withdraw some troops from the eastern part of Dacia. Hadrian was now emperor of the largest and most powerful empire the world had ever known, as in 117 AD, the Roman Empire was at the very height of its power, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the sun-baked sands of Arabia. Human civilization had seldom seen anything that even came close to rivaling its magnitude, but the sheer size of Rome's territories presented Hadrian with a number of dilemmas. He was now faced with the difficult challenge of securing his own rule within Rome, and then with the choice of either further expanding the empire's borders, much like his predecessor, or, on the other hand, consolidating Rome's grip over the territories it already possessed. This was a decision that would come to have massive consequences for the empire's future, as well as European and world history. The empire that Hadrian had inherited from Trajan was now in a state of near unprecedented turmoil and insurrection, as in 115 AD, whilst Trajan had been campaigning in the east, a massive revolt was beginning of the dispersed Jewish populations throughout the empire and the Middle East. These Jews had long been a thorn in the empire's side, as they had stubbornly resisted any Romanization of their culture and religion, leading to various revolts and wars over the preceding century. Although Trajan's expedition into Mesopotamia had been largely successful, Rome's resources, mighty as they were, had been stretched to the limit to pay for and man his campaigns. This included stripping many city garrisons in Rome's provinces in the Eastern Empire of large numbers of troops, which would then prove costly when the uprisings began in Egypt, North Africa, and Judea itself, subsequently resulting in mass killings and the pillaging of many towns and cities taking place in the affected provinces, and evidence suggests as many as 500,000 people were massacred in the Jewish revolts. Trajan had previously appointed one of his right-hand men, Lucius Quietus, to deal with the uprising in place of the ailing emperor, and he had subsequently dealt with the revolts by the time of Trajan's death. This uprising, in time, became known as the Kitos Wars. However, Quietus's success and ability did nothing but make him a target for Hadrian and his supporters, who were now looking to secure their power base by alienating and eliminating any potential rivals. The new emperor remained in the Middle East for a time, overseeing the mopping up of the Jewish rebellions in the region, whilst back in Rome, the Praetorian Guard, which was the bodyguard of the emperors, under the command of Hadrian's former guardian, Publius Aelius, rounded up and executed a number of high-ranking officials, whom they claimed were plotting to overthrow the new emperor. These included the commander of the Kitos Wars, Lucius Quietus, another high-ranking general, Aulus Cornelius Parma, and two other rival senators, Lucius Publilius Celsus and Gaius Avidius Nigrinus. Nigrinus in particular was seen as a threat to Hadrian, as he has sufficient wealth, rank, and connections to rival him. Indeed, it had been speculated that these officials, being advocates of expansion of the empire, may have caused problems for Hadrian, or might even rival his claim as emperor. It therefore came as no surprise that these men were abducted and killed under the supervision of Aetianus, while Hadrian himself remained in the east. His absence from Rome gave Hadrian plausible deniability with respect to the murders to a certain degree, but there was little doubt amongst the remainder of the Senate that Aetianus had acted under Hadrian's orders, and there remained from this point on considerable mistrust and bad blood between the Senate and the new emperor for the remainder of his reign. In an attempt to bring the Senate back on side, Hadrian promised that no further executions would occur under his rule, and he also promised to uphold the Senate's authority with regard to it remaining the highest court in the empire. But Aetianus himself was soon retired but not punished, and was later replaced as prefect of the Praetorian Guard by Hadrian's close friend Marcius Turbo, who was one of the emperor's most trusted and able advisors and commanders. Another reason for the execution of these senators had been that they were themselves close friends of the previous emperor Trajan, and also were in favour of the old emperor's expansionist policies, which had resulted in his campaigns in Dacia and the Middle East, whereas the recent revolts throughout the empire had convinced Hadrian that expansion was not only too expensive, but would also undermine the stability of the provinces already under Rome's control. There was, after all, always a finite amount of money available, and always a limited number of men of the right age to serve in the military. Therefore, endless conquest, with the aim of expanding the empire even more, would eventually result in it not being able to maintain order. With this in mind, the emperor then made the momentous decision that the Roman Empire's days of expansion were now over, and instead, Hadrian decided that the best way to ensure the survival of the Roman Empire in the medium to long term would be to strengthen and consolidate Rome's frontiers and also focus on the stabilization of Roman territories, which would then in theory bring about improved levels of peace and prosperity. After Hadrian had arrived in Rome, he sought to win the support of the populace by holding celebrations, both to mark the start of his reign and also to honor his predecessor Trajan, which he did by publicly burning the records of all tax arrears Rome's citizens owed to his government, which, along with other populistic measures, won over the support of the plebs and further weakened any potential grassroots support for his opponents within the Senate. It had been customary for previous Roman emperors to spend the vast majority of their reigns within the borders of Italy, and indeed within Rome itself, relying on messages from the provinces for information, and mainly only venturing outside of Italy to lead important campaigns such as Trajan's wars against Dacia and Parthia. However, Hadrian broke with this convention and made the decision to tour as many Roman provinces as he could in order to assess each one's governance for himself. It is recorded that he spent over half of his reign traveling outside of Rome and would often be accompanied by Vibia Sabina, as well as his entourage, which could number up to 5,000 people. In many ways, given his decision to consolidate the empire and not expand it, Hadrian had to do whatever he could in order to not only maintain his reputation, but also to maintain his connection with the Roman army, who more than most would be affected by his decision not to embark on aggressive expansion. This made the reasons for Hadrian's tour of the empire even more crucial, and also twofold, as firstly he wanted to be seen to take an active interest in the governance and lives of his subjects, and secondly, more than anything else, he had to keep the Roman army on his side in order to maintain his position. That being said, Hadrian knew that the Eastern legions could be relied upon for the time being at least, as they had been a decisive factor in him becoming emperor, whereas the legions in the other regions of the empire had not had a hand in his rise to power. Therefore, he first sought to win them over by initially touring the legionary garrisons in Eastern Europe along the rivers Danube as well as the Rhine. When in Germany, Hadrian oversaw the building of a wooden wall that was to mark the boundary of the Roman Empire in Germany and protect the citizens from the barbarians on the other side. And whilst visiting the legions, Hadrian also strove to experience the conditions and lives that everyday Roman soldiers experienced by dressing in ordinary clothing and eating the same food as the troops, such as bacon and vinegar, and would even march with his armies on foot for 20 miles a day under the blazing sun as well as in winter snows. But it was this willingness to mix with the troops that eventually paid dividends for the emperor, as they were soon firmly on his side. By this time, Britannia had been under Roman control for nearly 80 years, but its conquest had been a costly venture for the Roman Empire, as it had been in an almost constant state of revolt ever since. And so it was in 122 AD that Hadrian travelled northwest and across the English Channel to Britannia to inspect and oversee the state of the Roman occupation. The south of the island was, by this time, largely subdued. However, to the north, in modern-day Scotland, there were tribes who would not bend their knee to Rome, and who were a near constant source of trouble for the troops tasked with defending the empire's most northerly frontier. Hadrian assessed the situation and deemed that the lands in the far north of the islands were not worth the sacrifice of money and manpower that any military expedition to invade it would require, and he then ordered the building of a massive 73-mile-long wall to mark the northern boundary of the Roman Empire in Britannia, which took 6 years to complete and is now known as Hadrian's Wall. That was one of the largest single engineering projects ever undertaken by the Roman Empire, and was a statement of Hadrian's strength, as much as a defensive barrier, serving as a clear warning to Britain's northern tribes that its builders were far more powerful than they were. After leaving Britain, the emperor then travelled back across the English Channel, south across France and Spain, and on to eastern North Africa, where he led a campaign to subdue a rebellion in the area. However, word then reached him that a resurgent Parthia was attacking the Roman frontier garrisons in Mesopotamia. Therefore, he then travelled east across North Africa towards the Middle East, using the journey time to again order the construction of defensive walls along the empire's frontiers, but also to order the construction of new towns and buildings in the areas of North Africa which had been devastated by the Jewish uprisings in the Kitos Wars. As well as his famous wall in northern Britannia, the emperor would also construct other lengths of wall throughout the empire, which would enable Rome to control the flow of people to and from its territories, and also control the flow of trade caravans, which would boost tax revenue. Indeed, the North African economy boomed during Hadrian's reign, where he is still revered to this day as one of the greatest of Rome's emperors. Upon arriving in the Middle East, Hadrian quickly concluded a peace agreement with Parthia to end the conflict, and he set about inspecting the frontier defences in the area. Although Rome had annexed large portions of Mesopotamia during Emperor Trajan's campaigns in the Middle East, Hadrian had taken the decision to withdraw Rome's armies from the region and instead settle the frontier along the river Euphrates, which acted as a strong natural barrier. However, this decision to give up Rome's recent territorial gains in the Middle East was unpopular with the Senate, as Trajan's Parthian campaign had been undertaken at great expense in both money and manpower. The Senate's disapproval did not sway Hadrian, and he continued with his policy of consolidating the empire's frontiers so that they could be maintained in the future instead of risking an overextension of Rome's massive but still limited resources. With this in mind, the emperor continued his journey northwest into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and eventually entered the city of Claudiopolis, an ancient city with a history dating back to the time of the Hittite Empire. And whilst visiting the city, Hadrian saw a young man named Antinous, who would later become the love of his life. It was common in Greek culture for men to become lovers, and indeed bisexuality was also common in Rome with both sexes. However, Hadrian seems to have been homosexual, at least in preference, as he was, after all, married to his long-suffering wife Vibia Sabina, who herself was now further isolated and infuriated by her husband's new lover. Antinous was not of noble birth and had been noticed by Hadrian purely due to his good looks, which prompted the emperor to employ him as a servant. It seems that the bond between the two steadily grew until they were virtually inseparable. Indeed, Hadrian would come to celebrate and boast about his relationship with Antinous, as he more and more embraced the Greek culture and lifestyle, of which he was very proud. In many ways, Hadrian's reign can be seen as a departure from the old-style, clean-shaven, Roman-dominated culture in favour of a more inclusive empire that embraced its constituent provinces and cultures into a commonwealth-like state in which every citizen was a member, regardless of where they were born. That helped ensure that all the citizens of the empire felt like they had a stake in its continued prosperity, and also helped to make further insurrections less likely. On top of this, opening up the hitherto conservative Roman government to non-Roman persons of the various nations and cultures of which the Roman Empire was comprised, in many ways reflected Hadrian's own background, as he was himself a Spanish-born Roman emperor who held Greek culture to be one of the greatest achievements of the classical age. The Emperor Hadrian travelled to Greece itself in 124 AD, where he yet again oversaw the state of its governance, and during this trip, he commissioned the building of new temples and fountains, and took part in the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were a secretive and ancient Greek cult dedicated to Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and Persephone, goddess of the underworld, wife of Hades. The emperor particularly focused his attention on Athens, which was given a new library, aqueduct, and housing district as a reflection of Hadrian's affection for the city, and as thanks for both his reception and his treatment during his time as the city's magistrate before he became emperor. And also at this time there was a statue built of Hadrian, which was placed outside the Temple of Olympia and Zeus in Athens, which was the largest temple in Greece with over 100 columns. Hadrian then returned to Rome itself, where he oversaw the reconstruction of the Pantheon, a temple to all the gods, which had initially been built during the reign of Augustus, and as a mark of respect to Augustus, the renovations which Hadrian had carried out were attributed on the building itself to Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man and son-in-law, to show that the original building was in fact from the time of Augustus. The Pantheon was a marvel of Roman engineering, which was the largest unsupported dome in the world until the 20th century, and was constructed from materials including stone from all over the empire. These included marble columns from North Africa, which turned out on delivery to be too short for the temple's entrance, much to the emperor's displeasure. Indeed, the adjustments needed to the great temple's entrances can still be seen to this very day. Hadrian also oversaw the final stages of the construction of his new villa located at Tiber in the Sabine Hills, which was located 18 miles from Rome and was a sprawling and opulent place. Twice the size of Pompeii in area, it was comprised of a number of areas with features which differed in their style in order to reflect the different cultures of Rome's many provinces, and included around 30 buildings including villas, libraries, temples, baths, and theatres, as well as ponds and fountains. One possible reason for Hadrian spending more than half of his reign as emperor on the move was that he feared potential plots against him from the Roman Senate, who now, more than ever, resented the emperor's rule, as he had over the years continually ignored and alienated them from the process of government and filled the Senate chamber with as many of his supporters as he could. Another reason could be that over time, Hadrian had become accustomed to life on the move and seems to have found life in Rome to be distasteful. This resulted in him leaving the imperial capital again in the spring of 128 AD to travel to Africa, during which time he again inspected the frontier and its garrisons, and then in September of 128 AD he returned to Greece, where he once again took part in the Eleusinian Mysteries. Whilst in Greece, he also oversaw the creation of his Panhellenium, a council comprised of the various Greek city-states, as the emperor wanted to both protect and reignite Greek culture during his reign, which had, since Rome's accession to dominance in the region, been seen as subservient to the culture of Rome, and the fact that Hadrian was the first Roman emperor to wear a beard is thought by some to be a nod to Greek culture, as at the time, Roman men did not wear beards, but Greek men did. After visiting Greece, Hadrian crossed the Mediterranean to Egypt in October 130 AD, where he paid tribute at the tomb of Pompey the Great, and it was during this stay in Egypt that the emperor would experience what was for him a great tragedy, as during a boat trip on the River Nile, his beloved Antinous drowned on the 24th of October on the Feast of Osiris, the god of immortality. It is unclear whether his death was an accident or suicide, or even a sacrifice ordered by Hadrian himself, but whatever the cause, Hadrian was left devastated by the tragedy and honored the death of his lover by declaring him to be divine, after which he started a cult in Antinous' honor, even naming a city after him, as the city of Antinopolis on the River Nile was founded in his honor, and statues ordered by Hadrian were built all over the empire in his memory. Indeed, there were even festivals and games organized in his honor, and the statues and images of Antinous that survive today are the third most numerous after Augustus and Hadrian himself. After leaving Africa, the emperor then traveled through the Middle East until he finally returned to Greece, where he oversaw the final stage of the construction of the massive temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens in 132 AD. But it was during this time that word reached the emperor of another large-scale insurrection in Judea under the Jewish leader Simon Bar Kokhba. The Roman occupation of Judea had, by this time, resulted in large numbers of Romans settling in the area, who then received tax breaks. In addition, the Orthodox Jews were highly resistant to Roman attempts to impose their systems of belief on the Jewish population, as the Romans and Greeks had many gods, while the Jews, of course, believed in only one. This, combined with the previous large-scale revolts and wars between Rome and the Jews in the Eastern Empire, meant that ill feeling and resistance was still widespread. This undercurrent of discontent then erupted in 132 AD, resulting in heavy losses for the Roman garrisons in the region, whereupon Hadrian travelled to the Middle East to put down the uprising himself, eventually succeeding, which according to accounts resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews, and because of this, Hadrian is still a hated figure in Israel today. The Bar Kokhba revolt, as it is now known, was more of a full-scale war than a mere local insurrection, as the emperor had to call upon the support of over half a dozen legions, numbering up to 100,000 troops, to deal with the Jewish force, which itself numbered upwards of 200,000, according to accounts. However, the uprising was eventually quelled, after which the emperor abolished the province of Judea, renaming it Syria Palestina, and by 136 AD, the region was once again under full Roman control. This long-winded and bloody campaign in the searing heat of the Middle East had had much the same effect on Hadrian as campaigning in the region had for his predecessor Trajan, resulting in a downturn in his health, as by the end of it, he was suffering from exhaustion and stress, as well as swelling. Perhaps because of his ill health, Hadrian then returned to Rome, where his wife Vibia Sabina died in 136 AD, ending their long and bitter union, and after her death the emperor turned his attention to the succession, adopting Lucius Saonius Commodus as his son, making him his heir. Commodus was the son-in-law of Gaius Avidius Nigrinus, one of the consuls who had been executed in 118 AD, and the act could be seen as one of reconciliation. However, Commodus died on the 1st of January 138 AD, prompting Hadrian to then adopt Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus as his heir, who would later become Emperor Antoninus Pius and would himself go on to be emperor for nearly 23 years. Towards the end of his reign, he then ordered that his brother-in-law, Lucius Julius Ursus Servianus, and Servianus' grandson, Gaius Pedanius Fuscus Salinator, both be put to death, largely because Servianus had at the start of Hadrian's reign been a possible candidate for the succession, and was thought to be involved in an attempted coup in 137 AD by his grandson Salinator, who wanted power for himself. And although by 138 AD Servianus was much too old to be a viable successor, his grandson Salinator was still young and so posed a threat to the emperor. Before his death, Servianus is said to have prayed that Hadrian would long for death but be unable to die, and indeed, during his final illness, Hadrian is said to have attempted suicide several times but was prevented from killing himself, and by the summer of 138 AD, Hadrian's health had deserted him to such an extent that he retreated to his villa at Baiae, near modern-day Naples, where on the 10th of July, he died aged 62 after a reign of 21 years. The emperor was initially buried at Puteoli, close to Baiae, but subsequently his body was taken to Rome and buried in the gardens of Domitia. But once the tomb of Hadrian was completed in 139 AD, his body was cremated and his ashes were placed there in a purpose-built mausoleum built by Antonius Pius, which can still be seen to this day in Rome, along with the ashes of his wife, Vibia Sabina, and his first adopted son, Lucius Aelius, which were also placed alongside him. Following his death, Antoninus insisted that Hadrian be given divine honors, leading to a temple being built for him on the Campus Martius, which led to the Senate granting Antoninus the title of Pius in recognition of his final act of loyalty to Hadrian. The Emperor Hadrian is still thought of today as a complex and divisive figure by historians, as some see him as an authoritarian dictator who treated the Roman Empire as his own personal obsession, controlling its governance himself without listening to the opinions of Rome's Senate or people, and his actions, particularly in his suppression of the Jewish revolt late in his reign, still earn him criticism. Other historians, however, believe Hadrian was one of Rome's greatest emperors, who consolidated and prolonged the empire's life, and who reformed and rejuvenated its government both in Rome and in its provinces. Some also praise him for opening up the Roman government to people from outside of Italy, and for giving them greater influence in the Senate, which had, in the past, been dominated by the Roman aristocracy. In reference to Hadrian, the writer Pausanias, in his Guide to Greece, stated, "Within my own time, the emperor was extremely religious in the respect he paid to the deity, and contributed very much to the happiness of his various subjects. He never voluntarily entered upon a war." Whether Hadrian was an enlightened reformer or an egotistical authoritarian will always be debated, but the fact remains that wherever one cares to tread in modern-day Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East, one stands in lands whose history was, in many ways, shaped by his decisions, and there is no doubt that the actions he took in life transformed the future of the Roman Empire, and indeed the world, to such a degree that the name Hadrian is still known by millions, if not billions, of people alive today, nearly 1,900 years after his death. What do you think of the Emperor Hadrian? Was he one of Rome's most enlightened and capable emperors, or was he an authoritarian despot who used the Roman Empire and its resources to his own selfish ends, whilst crushing anyone who challenged him? Let us know in the comments section, and until next time, thank you very much for watching.